And to make up for last week and to um to continue with this week, we're going to be doing two Torah portions. One is last week's Torah portion, which is called Chayei Sarah, and the second is this week's Torah portion, which is called Toldot. I'm going to explain all those words, and we're as usual, we're going to do the summary of what's in this Torah portion and some highlights about some at least in Chayei Sarah, we're going to look at two personalities that are not part of the Israelite nation. But at this point, we're not really there's even until Moshe's time, we're not really the Israelite nation. We're really just a family, but who are not in the family. And when we get to Toldot, I want to do uh, a little sweet stuff with you about the character of Rivka. Okay, so let's start with Chayei Sarah, the summary. So Chayei Sarah is in the book of Bereshit and the book of Genesis, chapter 23, verse 1 through chapter 25, verse 18. So it's just 2.5 chapters. The name of the Parsha, Chayei Sarah, literally means the life of Sarah, and it's found as all the Parshiot are named, you probably know this already, by the first significant word or words in that Torah portion. Okay. What is ironic about this is that it's called Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, but really she dies at the very beginning of this story. And the rabbis say that the text says that she dies at 127 years of age in Hebron, which is in the land of Canaan, which is Hebron the way it is now. Abraham mourns her. And then he goes to the locals. Now, remember, at this point, Canaan, he's like a stranger in a strange land. It does not belong to him, even though God promised at some point in the future, this land would belong to you and your descendants. At this stage of the game, there's other people living there. And so he goes to talk to the the king of Hebron and asks him for a burial space so that he can bury his wife Sarah. And um, so initially, knowing that Abraham is an important person, they say to him that they're willing to give him whatever plot of land he wants, the best part of their town, um, and he can just have it as a gift. But he doesn't trust that, and he says, "No, I'm going to pay for it." Okay, and only then, after he pays for it, does he bury his wife where? In the cave of Machpelah in the land of Canaan. So the cave of Machpelah today is known as, what is it called in English? Is it
Cave
called
of the yeah,
the cave of
cave
the
of
patriarchs? Right. Ironically, I like to call it the cave of the matriarchs and the patriarchs. Okay. But Sarah is she's not actually the first one to be born there because do you know who's buried there? I'm sorry. Do you know who was buried there before her? What was so special about this plot of land? Unmute yourself, Ginny, because I think you know.
Okay, was it Adam and Eve and
Yes, it
Hava?
was. Yes, it
Yes.
was.
Okay.
Adam and Chava. Okay, so Adam and Eve are already buried there. So it already has a certain level of holiness in this plot of land. And what is so crazy, it's like a 20-minute drive from where I live to go there. And we were there not too long ago for, well, I was there for some prayer thing. I don't remember what it was. I whatever it was. But and then before that, just like a week or so before that, we were there for a bar mitzvah. And so on the grounds, we've been there for weddings, we've been there to pray. But this particular place is where Abraham buries his wife Sarah in the cave of the matriarchs and the patriarchs, Marat HaMachpelah, which Teresa will see for herself in just a few weeks, God willing. Okay, so now Sarah is gone. And Abraham decides it is time to find a wife for Yitzchak, okay, for Isaac. I'm going to call him by his Hebrew name, but when I say Yitzchak, I mean Isaac. So he says to his eldest servant, he tells him to swear by the God of heaven and earth that you will not take a wife from the locals. Don't take a wife for my son from the Canaanites, but go back to my homeland and take a wife from among my family. Okay. And the servant says, well, what if the woman doesn't want to follow me back into Canaan? Um, should I bring your son there? And Abraham says, don't bring my son there. That the God who took me from my father's house will send an angel to help you out. And if the woman doesn't want to go with you, then you are free of the oath. But for right now, I want you to take an oath, that a very serious oath, that you are going to bring a woman back that's appropriate for my son Yitzhak. So the servant swears to Abraham this oath, and he takes a bunch of Abraham's uh, wealth. He takes 10 camels, some of his finest things, and he journeys to the city where Abraham came from, which is somewhere between modern day Syria and Turkey. Okay, so it's not Canaan, but it's like in the neighborhood. All right. And when he gets to the city, he makes the camels stop and kneel down outside the city by wherever the well of water is in the evening, when he knows, I don't know how he knows this, but he knows that this is when the women of the town come to draw water. And the servant says, kind of like a prayer request, he says that the girl, if I ask her for water so that I can have a drink, and she responds, drink and I will give your camels water too, I'll know that that's the one. So the servant hardly finishes speaking this prayer idea, this prayer thought, when Rivka, who is a descendant of Abraham, comes to the well and fills her pitcher. And the servant runs to meet her and he says, like this, let me please sip a little water from your pitcher. And she says, drink, and then I'll draw water for your camels as well. Okay. So, I want to show you this. I hope you can see this. This is, um, it's so hard with this background. Wait, can you see? No, not yet. It's a children's book. You have to take my word for it. Okay. It's a children's book called Kind Little Rivka, and it tells over this story. Um, Trust me, that's what it is. I know you can't see the book. Okay. But it tells over this story about how and the rabbis want us to know, apparently camels have an enormous capacity for water. So she didn't just, give them like a little sip, but she went back and back, and filled her pitcher many, many times. Okay. And as she does so, this servant is like just in awe, but he doesn't say anything because he just wants to make sure that God has made his journey successful. And so after the camels finish drinking, by the way, the rabbis say that because of the holiness of Rivka, even though she was a little girl at the time, that the water came up to her and responded to her. So she still had a lot of work to do, and she was a young girl. Some people say she was as young as 3, which is not like what a 3-year-old is now, but she was a young girl. Anyway, she finishes watering the camels, and then the servant takes out some jewelry, a ring, some golden bracelets, and he says, because now he wants to make sure she's from the right family. She says, whose daughter are you? And is there room in your father's house for us to stay overnight? And she says, yes, come stay. And she explains her lineage. So Abraham has a brother, Nahor. Nahor has a son called Betuel. Betuel is Rivka's father. Okay. So Rivka is Abraham's great niece. All right. Her grandfather is Abraham's brother. That's the relationship. Okay. So she comes from the family of Abraham. So the servant bows his head and he prostrates himself before God and he says, blessed be God, the God of my master Abraham. Now, this servant does not come from the family of Abraham. All right. But he is the chief servant and he has watched and grown up in the house of Abraham. And so he has a connection to Hashem. Okay. So Rivka then runs and tells her mother what happened at the well. And Rivka has a brother whose name is Lavan. I don't know what you call him. Laban, maybe? Is that what you call him? Okay. Lavan sees that she's now got these gifts of gold. And so he goes to greet the man and to invite him to come into the house. Lavan is a dirty, slimy character. Excuse me. Um, and he sees that this visitor has given his sister some jewelry, so he assumes that he's a wealthy man and he wants a piece of it. the servant of Abraham comes in and he explains his mission. He says, I'm a servant of Abraham. My master is very wealthy. He's rich with animals and money and servants and so forth. And Sarah, my master's wife, had a son that to who will inherit everything that Abraham has. And he asked me to leave Canaan to come here to find a wife from among his family. And so he basically retells the whole story. This is very significant because I believe it's 67 verses of first the story happens and then Eliezer repeats the story when he's talking to Rivka's family. Now, why is that important? Because there are so many things in the Torah that are just mentioned in passing, or they're mentioned in the briefest way. And this dialogue, but Eliezer's journey and his repeating of the story is given a lot of airtime. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so Lavan and his father, who is Bethuel, who it would be Abraham's nephew, um, agrees that this has come from God because it's all we say in Hebrew the hashgacha, but I don't, not coincidence, but it's like godly driven, like it's all happening so smoothly, it's all playing out so smoothly. And he brings gifts also for the family. He gives gold to Rivka, but he has fruits and other kinds of things for the family, and he stays with them overnight. The next morning, the family says they want Rivka to stay for like 10 months or a year to get ready for her wedding. The servant says, please don't delay me because God has clearly given me success. I want to bring her back. They call Rivka in and they ask her if she's prepared to go with this man who she just met yesterday. And she says that she will go. I find this very interesting because number one, she is very young, but she is already um, has a mind of her own that we see. And we know that in Judaism, even though we do have a concept of helping to make matches, we don't have uh, arranged marriages. In other words, the couple always has a say, even the wife, the woman, always has a say in who gets married. Anyway, so she agrees to go with Elias with this servant right away, and they send her away with their blessings. And as they get close to, they're back in Canaan, and they get close to where Yitzhak, her intended, he is meditating in the field, and he sees the convoy of camels coming. Rivka takes a veil and she covers herself, and the servant tells Yitzhak the whole story. And then Yitzhak brings her into his mother's tent and he marries her. And the text says he marries her and then he loves her. So that's another interesting thing. They didn't date for a long time and fall in love. They got married. He came to love her, and only then says the Parsha was he comforted for the loss of his mother. That's sort of one storyline. The other storyline is now that Yitzhak is married and he's settled, and he's about 40 years old at this point, Avraham gets remarried. And I think I mentioned this to you. Avraham gets remarried. He takes a wife named Keturah. Keturah, according to the rabbis, is Hagar. And she's called Keturah because her deeds were as sweet as incense. The word for incense is ketoret. Interestingly enough, there's a street in my neighborhood called Pitum HaKetoret. And the ketoret is the incense that specifically the combination of herbs and spices, whatever that were offered in the temple. And with this additional marriage, she had six more children. And those sons had more sons and so forth. But Yitzchak was the only inheritor. So everything that Abraham had, even though he had seven sons, including Ishmael, from Hagar slash Keturah, he gave all of his material wealth to Yitzchak. And that's the line that becomes the Israelite nation. Now, he did give other gifts to Keturah's children, but he gave them gifts and he sent them away. And I might have mentioned this to you before, that he sent them to the east. And there, where we see a parallel between Eastern religion, Eastern wisdom, and Torah thinking, the idea is that it came through this line, that these were the sons of Abraham, that he taught some of this universal wisdom of Torah, and um, and they brought it to the east. At the age of 175, Abraham passes away, and both of his primary sons, Yitzchak and Yishmael, bury him next to Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, in the cave in Hebron. Um, and then it talks a little bit about um, the descendants of Yishmael. We're gonna skip that. Okay. Now, here's the two characters I want to focus on. One of them is the guy that Abraham bought the cave from. His name is Ephron, and he is at that point. Remember, I told you that in Canaan, Abraham doesn't have possession of the land yet, even though it's been promised to him multiple times. So there's a tribe there called the Hittites, and they are the tribe that control the area of Hebron, which is, by the way, one of the four holiest cities in Israel. Hebron is one of them. Who knows what the other three are? Just unmute yourself and say. Well, you can guess one of them at least.
But
Jerusalem, Ephrat, and something else.
Okay, Jerusalem is correct. Tzfat is correct. Not Efrat, but Tzfat. I know they rhyme. And the other one is
area.
Tiberia or Tiberius. Okay, those are the others. Anyway, so Hebron is an important city, and even today it's considered one of the four holiest cities. So Abraham knows when he goes to buy this cave that Ephron is not honest. He seems to be offering in that he says, "Oh, take you're a great man, take whatever land you want." Um, but Abraham knows that he can't be trusted, so he pays a great deal of money so that he can be absolutely certain that the cave and the field around it belong to him. Now, throughout this exchange, when Ephron is promising everything to Abraham, in Hebrew, his name is spelled Ayin Pei Resh Vav Nun Sofit, okay? 5 letters. But then in chapter 23, verse 16, just as Abraham is weighing out the silver shekels to pay for this land, Ephron's name is spelled with only 4 letters, Ayin Pei Resh Nun Sofit. It's missing a letter. It's missing a letter to indicate that his status was diminished in the eyes of his people because he promised, he's a big talker and he promised this to Abraham, but then he took money in the end, not only a little bit of money, but like full payment. But there's also a teaching that while Abraham was weighing out the silver, that Ephron stole some of it. And so the spelling of his name is diminished because his his character is diminished. So rather than being kind and generous the way he portrayed himself initially, he's really shown to be not just a liar, because he does take money for it, but also a thief. Now, this other thing about Ephron that my husband taught me, I thought this was so fascinating. Ayin Pei Resh Vav Nun Sofit, which is Ephron, is also the spelling of the Hebrew word iparon. Iparon means a pencil. Now, what does that, why? Because the vowels are different. Um, when you spell them without vowels, they're exactly the same word. Now, what's the connection? So this is my husband's idea. A pencil can write, but it can also erase. Whatever is recorded with a pencil can be erased with the swipe of an eraser. So that, in a nutshell, was Ephron. In one breath, he promised to give the land at no cost, and in the next breath, he took full payment for it, written and erased. I think that's a very cool insight. I hope you guys think so too. Okay, the other person I want to focus on in this parsha is Eliezer. Eliezer is, of course, the servant. And there's many aspects of Eliezer's life that are worth mentioning. One of which I mentioned to you that he the story happens of how he comes upon Rivka, and then it is retold in all of these verses. And so the rabbis say um, that the story of even our ancestor servants is more pleasing to God than the Torah of their descendants. This, I think, is exactly the flip side of, and I might be wrong about this, tell me if I am, of the way um, Christianity teaches that the more time goes on, the more is revealed. But Judaism has exactly sort of the opposite view, and that is that the older a personality is, like the further away in time, the holier it is, the more precious it is. Okay. So Eliezer is the faithful servant of Abraham, but he's only mentioned by name once in scripture as part of a conversation between Abraham and Hashem. So Abraham is pleading for a child, and he bolsters his argument to God. This is before Yitzhak is born. He says, "What will you give me, since by going childless, I am childless, and the steward of my household, Demesek Eliezer," that's how he's referred to. That's you, he's the one who's going to inherit everything. This, if you want to look it up, it's in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 15, verses 2 and 3. This is where Eliezer is called Demesek Eliezer. And there's two reasons. What's the meaning of this word Demesek that precedes his name? So the sages of the Talmud say that it can be divided into two other words. Remember, with Hebrew, without vowels, we can pronounce it in different ways. Dole umashke, which means he ladles out and he gives to drink. What was it he was ladling out and give to drink? Abraham's teachings about monotheism, Abraham's teaching about morality that he learned and he shared with other people. Okay, so one of the ways of understanding his name was that he was like a teaching assistant for Abraham, and he took the same messages that Abraham and Sarah were sharing, and he shared it where he could. But there's another meaning that Demesek is Damascus in Hebrew, that it means he was from Damascus. Taking things a step further, the Midrash says that he was named that because in the war of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings that happened already, that Abraham fought in order to rescue his nephew Lot, Eliezer participated in that war, and it says that he chased the 4 kings until the city of Damascus. All right. So before we really meet Eliezer, we read about this battle of the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and it says that Abraham led his proteges in battle for the freedom of the captives, and it says that he had 318 men. Who were these 318 men? According to tradition, it was only Eliezer, because the numerical value of the name Eliezer is 318. Okay, so they have a long history. Abraham and Eliezer, they go way back. He is his battle partner. He is sharing his teachings with other people. He is the head of his household, and he's the one who's sent off on this mission to find a wife for this precious, precious son. So, again, but he's only named one time. Everywhere else, he's just called the servant of Abraham. What the rabbis say is that before he was sent off, Eliezer had a daughter, and he hoped that his daughter would be the one to marry Yitzhak. He wanted to marry into the family, not himself, but his daughter. And and Abraham knew that. And that's why he said, I only want Yitzhak to marry somebody from my extended family, not from the locals. Okay. According to according to Rashi, that Abraham actually said to him, this sounds a little harsh to me, but he said, my son is blessed and you are cursed. Why was he cursed? Eliezer was a descendant of Canaan who had been cursed by Noah. And he says a cursed one cannot unite with a blessed one. So that's sort of Abraham saying, I understand you want your daughter to marry my son. It's not going to happen. Um, when we hear um, when we hear that this exchange happened and still Eliezer went on this mission to find a wife, so his own desire for his family to intermarry with the family of Abraham is dashed, and that's not going to happen. That he goes anyway with a full heart, and um, he puts his personal needs and wishes and desires aside, and his sole purpose is to do his master's bidding. Okay, that there needs to be another generation of Abraham's descendants, and that it needs to happen through a woman who is from Abraham's family, married to Yitzhak. So he has this idea, doesn't come to fruition, but he puts all that aside and he goes and does exactly what his master asked him to do. The Eliezer was so important in the house of Abraham that he experienced miracles on his own. When he went on his mission, one of the miracles that he experienced was that the entire trip from Canaan to um, where he was going, remember I told you it was near modern day Syria and Turkey, it took him just one day. He didn't fly, obviously. He went with a group of 10 camels and other people and so forth. But that there's a concept that the road, it's called in Hebrew kfitzat haderech, that the road is shortened. Right, exactly. And this miracle also happened for Yaakov. It happened, if you want to look it up, in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 28, verse 11. We haven't gotten there yet. But that it is sort of a special thing that God does when somebody sets out on a journey, on a holy mission, and he makes it easier by making the journey shorter. Okay. Also, the rabbis say that Eliezer actually physically resembled Abraham. That, but one of the ways that he resembled him, whether we understand that physically, that he like their faces look similar, but he ruled over his own desires and urges, just like Abraham did. And we saw that when we saw that even though Abraham said, "Your daughter will not have anything to do with my son," he didn't let that stop him from fulfilling his master's wishes. So he was a very, very, very important and holy and strong character, even though he doesn't come from the family of Abraham. Just a couple of other things. He was, according to one tradition, he was the son of Nimrod. And so here's the lineage. There's Noah, okay? Noah has three sons. One of them is Ham. Ham has a son called Cush. Cush has a son called Nimrod. A lot more to say about him. And Nimrod has a son called Eliezer. Okay. And the last, is this the last thing? No, there's more that I'm going to tell you, but there is a tradition that there are nine holy people that entered into the next world without dying in this world first. And the list includes some righteous people that you know, including Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu and Navi, Hiram, the king of Tyre, and also Eliezer is on this list. There's, if you want to know, I can. Another person who's on the list that I think is interesting to mention is Batya, who is the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, her story comes in a few weeks, and also Serach, who's the daughter of Asher. We haven't talked about her yet either, but there are both men and women on this list, and that they are said to all have been on such a high spiritual level that they never died in the physical way that the rest of us do, and they just went directly into the next world, however you understand that. And this I'm going to skip a couple things. We're running out of time. His soul. So it says that when Eliezer came back into this world as Caleb, one of the only two spies, along with Yehoshua, along with Joshua, who remained faithful to the mission to go check out the land of Israel. And what is Caleb known for? He's known for visiting Hebron, What's in Hebron? The grave of his master Avraham, his master in another life. He goes there to pray for divine assistance on this in his incarnation as Kalev, and he is still connected to Hebron, where his master died. The name Eliezer, by the way, is actually, even though he wasn't from the family of Abraham, he wasn't Jewish. There's a lot of Jewish men named Eliezer, and Eliezer literally means "my God helps." Eli is my God, and Ezer means help. You might be familiar with the expression Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmate opposite him. That is something that the rabbis talk about the role of Chava. Ezer, when you go to a store today in Hebrew, they will ask you if Sharla Azors, do you need help? Is it possible for me to help you? So my God helps. It's a beautiful name. Okay. That is a little bit about Chayei Sarah, even though we didn't talk about Sarah really much at all. And now let's move to Toldot, which is this week's Parsha. This is in the book of Bereshit. It's just a continuation. So it's the book of Bereshit, Genesis chapter 25, verse 19, until chapter 28, verse 9. The name of the Parsha Toldot means generations, and it's found right in the first verse in Genesis chapter 25, verse 19. Okay, so just continuing with the narrative, and Bereshit is very narrative heavy. Some of the books later on in the year, when we get to other books, there's not as much storyline. There's not as many um, stories playing out. But the book of Bereshit is beloved in part, especially by women, because there's so much family drama and family and relationships and all that kind of stuff. So here's the continuation of the story. Rivka and Yitzhak are ready to have a child. Now, if you understand, as the rabbis do, that when Rivka married Yitzhak, she was 3 years old, and 3 years old doesn't mean what it means now, but the idea was that she was young. They waited 10 years until she was physically mature enough to have a child, and they pray to God, and Rivka does get pregnant. And there's this very famous, well, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but as she's pregnant, she feels some weird stuff going on in her body. And the text says that she went to ask God, what is going on here? And that God answered her, two nations are in your womb. They will be divided from each other, starting from within you. One will become mightier than the other, and the mighty one shall serve the lesser one. Okay. And this is so incredibly relevant to what we're living through now, because these two nations are um, are still in the world today. So Rivka gives birth, and she has two boys. The first boy comes out red and hairy, and they name him Esav. You may know him as Esau. We're going to call Esav. And the second is a smooth-skinned baby who they name Yaakov, who you may call Jacob. Okay. When the boys grow up, Esav is very drawn to hunting and farming, and Yaakov is only interested in learning Torah, whatever Torah existed at that point. Now, Yitzchak, his of the twins, his favorite one is Esav, and Rivka's favorite one is Yaakov. Uh, now comes a day. Now the text doesn't say this, but I'm going to tell you that on this particular day, there were two important things that happened in the backstory. One is that this is the day that Abraham died, and the second is that Esav had come back from killing Nimrod. Okay. Nimrod, remember, was Eliezer's father, not a nice guy. And we'll talk about why was he out there killing Nimrod? But anyway, he comes back from the field and he's hungry and he's faint. And he sees that Yaakov is making a pot of something. The what it actually was some kind of lentil dish, red lentil dish, but some translations say stew. And what is the connection? So in Judaism, when you come back from a funeral, if you're a mourner, in the immediate family, the mourning family, you are greeted with a round food. The symbolism of that is this, like the cycle, the circle of life, and so forth. You've just buried a loved one, and the food itself reminds you that life is a circle, which is also an interesting subliminal reference to reincarnation. Okay, so generally, we give people hard-boiled eggs or something with lentils. And anyway, so they've just buried Abraham, and Yaakov is making this meal for the mourners. He's making lentil stew, and Esav asks him for some of it. And Yaakov says, "Yeah, I'll give you some of it if you sell me your birthright." And Esav stares at his brother and he says, "If I'm going to die from hunger, what good is my birthright?" So he says, "You can have it. Just give me a bowl of that red stuff." And Esav eats and he drinks and he leaves. Okay. And that is how little how little care he gave for the fact that he was a firstborn. Fast forward. Now Yitzhak, the father of these twins, becomes old and blind. And he calls out to Esav, because Esav's the oldest and it's his favorite. And he says to his son, "Go hunt some venison for me and prepare a tasty dish that I love and bring it to me and I will eat it and then I will bless you before I die." Rivka overhears this conversation between Esav and Yitzhak, and she tells Yaakov what she heard, and she says to him, now you know this story, but I'm just saying because I want to go a little deeper. She says, um, to Yitzchak, "We're gonna kind of trick your father. Go into the flock and fetch me two goats, and I'm gonna make him a nice dish, and then you're gonna bring it to him, and he's gonna bless you, eat it and bless you before his death." Yaakov does not want any part of this deceptive game, not game, it's a very serious thing, but this deceptive action. And he said to his mother, "How are we going to pull this off?" Esav is, even though Yitzchak is blind, Esav is hairy and I'm smooth skinned. And if he touches me, he's going to see that I'm an imposter and he's going to curse me instead of blessing me. And Rivka says, and there's very famous words, "Upon me be your curse, my son. Now do what I said and go get the goats so I can make a stew." Yaakov does reluctantly agree to what his mother tells him to do. And then she prepares this dish that his father loves. And before he goes to give the meal to his father, his mother puts on hairy goat skins on his hands and on his neck. And she's basically dressing him in Esav's clothing. Okay. And they're hoping that this ruse works. Now Yaakov goes to see his father with this food, and he sort of fudges his identification because Yitzhak asks, "Who are you?" And he says, "It is I, Esav, your firstborn. I've done what you told me, and I brought you this yummy dish. Please have something to eat so that your soul can bless me." And he says, Yitzhak says, "How did you do this so fast? You had to go hunt and find the animal." And he says, "Because God, your God, caused it to happen before me." Now, Esav was not in the habit of speaking about Hashem. And that was a clue to Yitzhak. There's a whole deeper layer of what did Yitzhak really know and how much was this deception really, did they pull the wool over his eyes? That might be actually where that expression comes from. I wonder if it is pulling the wool over his eyes. Anyway, so Yitzhak says, "Come closer so that I can feel you and see if you're really my son," because he seems to have some doubt. And he feels his skin and he says this famous line, "The voice is the voice of Yaakov, but the hands are the hands of Esav." And so they go through it a couple more times. Finally, Yitzhak is satisfied that this is in fact Esav, even though it isn't. And he eats the stew and he drinks whatever the wine that he brought. And he says, "Come closer." And Yitzhak can smell his son's clothes, and then he gives a blessing. And he gives him a tremendous blessing. And then when he finishes blessing this child that he thinks is Esav, or he purports to think that it's Esav, Yaakov leaves the room. Okay. And then, like, enter stage left comes Esav and he's bringing some kind of food to his father. Now, it doesn't say this in the text, but the rabbis say he was not successful hunting that day, but he found a dog that was dying, and that's what he prepared as a meal for his father. Now, besides the fact that it didn't have kosher slaughter, a dog is not kosher. So it gives you like a sense of Esav's character. Um, anyway, so Esav says, "Okay, father, come and eat this meal that I gave you so that your soul can bless me." And Yitzchak is taken by surprise. He says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm your son, your firstborn Esav." And Yitzchak says, "Well, then who did I just bless? Who brought me this delicious meal and moved me to give this blessing?" And so Esav hears what's going on and he cries out. And this is, if you're inclined to be sympathetic toward Esav, this is the moment that you might feel that, because he says to his father, um, "Don't you have any blessings left for me?" And Yitzchak says, "Your brother has come. He's taken away your blessing." And Esav is really mad now because number one, he claims that Yaakov took away his birthright. I told you that whole episode with the lentil and how easily he gave it away, and now he's taken away the blessing. And he's begging his father, "Don't you have any blessing for me?" And Yitzchak replies, "Esav, I've made Yaakov a master to you, and I've given him all material blessings." And again, Esav cries, "Please, there must be something left." And he gives Esav a minor blessing. At this point, Esav now hates his brother with such a passion, with such a vengeance, because of this whole thing. And he says in his heart, "As soon as my father dies, then I'm going to go kill my brother Yaakov." And Rivka finds out Esav's plan to kill Yaakov, and she says, "Go, run away, go to my brother Lavan." Remember, Rivka and Lavan were siblings. Stay with him until your brother chills out. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. Then I'll send for you, because if you stay here, I'm going to lose both of you in the same day. And so Rivka makes up another story, and she approaches her husband to say that she doesn't want Yaakov to take a wife from the local women. This is a theme that we saw before. Um, Esav has married some of the local women, and it has caused a lot of conflict in the family. So she says it's going to be better for Yaakov to go to Lavan and find a wife from among the women there. Yitzchak agrees. He calls Yaakov and blesses him and tells him, "Go, don't take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Go to your mother's brother's house and take a wife from among his daughters, and God should protect you." And off he goes. Okay. As soon as Esav hears that his father tells Yaakov not to marry a local, he knows that the daughters of Canaan are displeasing to his parents. So he goes to the family of Yishmael, who's Abraham's other son. Okay, so it's his uncle, and he takes one of Yishmael's daughters for a wife. Now, in the world today, the Jewish people are understood to be the descendants of Jacob, Yaakov. The Arab people that are understood, the Muslims are understood to be descendants from Yishmael, and the descendants of Esav is the Christian world. Okay, so these nations, if you will, are still on the world stage. At this point, Esav goes and he makes an alliance with Ishmael. So that's Christianity making an alliance with Islam against the Jews. And that's very much at play right now. All right. Let me try to finish this in the time that we have left. I want to go back to this idea of in chapter 25, verse 22, when Rivka is pregnant. The traditional explanation for the idea of the children struggling within her is that while she was pregnant, if she passed the entrance of a Torah academy, that Yaakov would wriggle within her and try to come out. And when she passed by the entrance of a temple of idolatry, that Esav would wriggle and try to come out. That is how powerfully their natures were set in them way before birth. And according to tradition, it's because of who they were in a previous life. Now, the text says that Rivka goes to inquire of God, what's going on in my womb, because it's very painful to her, and she knows that other women don't have this kind of specific kind of pain. And our rabbis teach that where did she go? She went to the academy of Shem and Aver. Shem is the son of Noach, and Aver was his grandson. And they told her, and this is chapter 25, verse 23. This is what the text says. And the Lord said to her, but it wasn't God talking to her, it was Shem. Two nations are in your womb, two kingdoms will separate from your innards. One kingdom will become mightier than the other kingdom, and the elder will serve the younger. Who's the elder? The elder is Esav. Will serve the younger. Who's the younger? Yaakov. Meaning, according to this, that the West will eventually serve Israel. The tradition is that when these nations, Israel from Yaakov and the West from Esav, when one rises, the other falls. They'll never be equally great. Okay. Esav, we are taught, becomes Edom. Edom is related to the Hebrew word Adom, which means red. That becomes Rome, which becomes Christianity, which becomes Western culture. That's the line of Esav. Okay. Um, I'm going to skip this part. Let's talk about the garments, these particular garments of Esav. If you go to chapter 27, verse 15, that Rivka takes these garments that Esav has that were with her in her house, and she dresses Yaakov, her younger son, in them before she sends him to go and talk to Yitzhak to try to get a blessing. Now, we see that Rivka had some of these garments with her already in her house. Why would that be? Esav, he already had a few wives. Didn't he have wives that he could trust these garments with? So the rabbis teach two interesting things. One is that he was actually suspicious of his own wives because he knew that they would steal without thinking twice about it. But there was something very special about these garments. Our rabbis say that these were the garments that God gave to Adam and Chava after the sin in the Garden of Eden. How did they get to Esav? Okay. Um, Adam and Chava eat from the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. They come to be ashamed of their nakedness. God fashions these special garments for them, and they are cherished by the descendants of Adam, and they're eventually passed on to Noah. And after the flood, Noah gives them to his grandson, Nimrod. Nimrod was an unsavory character, and he used them and their special powers not for holy things, but for hunting. He realized that when he was wearing these garments, he had superhuman strength, and it made him a superb hunter and a mighty warrior. Now, years later, remember I told you the night or the afternoon, I don't know what time of day it was, the day that Abraham dies, and Esav comes and he sells his birthright for this pot of lentils. The What was he doing? I told you he was murdering Nimrod. He murdered Nimrod and stole these garments, and that's how he became in possession of them. Those are the garments that Yaakov wore when he went in to get the blessing from Yitzhak. Okay, so you see the whole chain here. I want to I want to finish with some comments about Rivka because there's something very interesting in her story. We've already gone over it, but I'm gonna go over it again so you see the difference between then and now. So when she's pregnant, I told you that this is chapter 25, verse 22. The children struggled within her, and she said, "If it be so, why am I like that?" And she went to inquire of the Lord. At this stage, Rivka's a young woman. Some say she's about 20 years old when she's pregnant. And the Midrash says, I told you this, that she went to the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, and Shem, who had some kind of Ruach HaKodesh, he had some kind of a lower form of prophecy, he explains to her what's going on. Much later, she's now an older woman. Yaakov doesn't want to undertake this little deception that she's created, but she assures him when she says, this is chapter 27, verse 13. His mother said to him, "On me is your curse, my son. Only listen to my voice and go and do what I'm asking." And from this, Yaakov understands that Rivka has prophecy, and she knows that this is the right thing to do to orchestrate this switching of the blessing. A couple of verses later, chapter 27, verse 42, Rivka was told the words of Esav, her elder son. What are those words? That as soon as Yitzhak dies, he's going to kill Yaakov. And this is when she calls him and says, I need to send you away. Now, the text says that she was told the words of Esav. But the Midrash says she was told by divine inspiration what Esav was thinking. He never said it, but she picked it up. So when she's 20, she doesn't know what's going on. She has to go to Shem at the yeshiva of Shem and Eber to get an understanding of what's going on. And in this verse, it says she's told, but really, by this point, she has by the time her sons are grown and Yitzhak is about to die and she's 81 years old approximately, all her life she worked to be closer to Hashem. As a young woman, she needed to hear the message through a third party. But by the time she herself was the mother of adult children, she had worked on herself so much and grown so much that she was able to receive prophecy directly. I think that's a very important point because it shows that even though even as a child, she grew up in a home that was not like it wasn't so upright, but she was like a rose among the thorns in her home growing up. So she already had this potential, but in all of the decades of her life, she worked on herself spiritually so that she was able to receive prophecy directly at that point. And the last thought, and this I learned from my teacher. I reviewed it with her again this week. So I want to make sure I said it. Abraham was unable to see Yishmael as evil, as problematic, but Sarah saw it, right? Remember, Sarah says, "Get this guy out of my house. He will not inherit with my son." So Abraham, who is a great prophet and spoke to God, was unable to see the true nature of his own son. Similarly, Yitzchak is unable to see in Esav the evil in Esav that Rivka saw. So the idea in Jewish thought is that the Satan, the sort of the negative, the evil, I don't even know how to describe this, um, the evil nature. Let's just call it the Satan because I don't know another way to say it. Blinded both Abraham and Yitzhak so that they couldn't see the true nature of their children. In other words, it really wasn't their fault that they couldn't see it. It doesn't take away from their greatness in other ways, but they were just literally unable to see the truth of the situation that the mothers could clearly see. Why were the mothers not similarly blinded? I just love this idea. She says, because the Satan did not know that the women had spiritual gifts. In other words, it didn't even occur to him to blind the mothers because he totally underestimated their spiritual power. And that's how it will be in the future. When the true spiritual power of women is fully realized in the world, and those who all through history have sold women short are going to be shocked when the spiritual power of women becomes fully expressed in this world. So that's a good place to end. That is our time, and I'm asking if did somebody leave a message in chat that I didn't see? Hang on. Oh, okay. Just agreeing with something I said. Okay. Um, any any questions or comments that you want to make before we finish up?
There was, if it's okay, I've learned not so long ago that Laban was also a sorcerer who was um, who was in connection with Bilam.
Right.
And so it was, for me, it was very interesting because it was putting the thing more concrete, and it explained to me why it was very difficult for Jacob. I mean, we'll see that maybe later on, but like when Jacob had to go to Sharan, it was a very hard time for him because it's not really, I mean, like again, in the Christian tradition, you don't know almost anything about all these things. And learning all these things, for me, it was like seeing more the reality of how it was for Jacob. And so but he was the brother of Rivka. So it's very interesting.
So there's
Rivka was
truth.
amazing.
Rivka was
Rivka
what?
was Rivka was amazing. She grew, she
Right.
blossomed, and Lavan was the
Right.
opposite.
So the rabbis have a lot to say about the environment in which we are raised and what it has, how it connects to our natures. So I use the expression a rose among thorns. Rivka grew up in a household of sorcerers and liars and cheaters, and we see that later on when Yaakov goes there, and maybe next week even, these stories start to play out just how deceptive Lavan is, which makes Rivka even more extraordinary because even though she wasn't in that environment for such a long time, she was there long enough to distinguish herself from the path that the rest of her family took. That's number one. Number two is for Yaakov, for Jacob, who grew up in a holy home with Rivka and Yitzchak as his parents, even though his brother was a bit of a bad egg, but he spent all of his life and all of his time studying Torah and sitting in the tent, and he was a very peaceful kind of an upbringing among holiness. Now he's got to go into the big bad world and deal with nasty stuff. It's a little bit like if you have somebody who grows up in a very sheltered, conservative, religious enclave, right? And then let's say you send them to the University of Miami. I'm just making something up, right? Some secular institution, and they've never dealt with anything like that. It's a big shock to the system. So that's a whole other area of exploration is how people come from one environment and how they stay connected to Hashem or don't stay connected to Hashem based on what the environment in which they find themselves. Right. Right. And that is the true test. It is much easier, and you probably know this from your own experience. If you grow up in a religious family, it is much easier to be um like on the road and do all the right things when everybody around you lives that way and so forth. When you are exposed to people who have different values, sometimes it becomes very hard to hold your center, right? So this is very much at play in the Jewish community, but I'm sure it's at play in every community that tries to protect um, protect its community from the schmutz and the nefarious stuff that's going on outside the community. It's very, very hard in today's time. Anybody else before we finish?
I had one question, Rivka. My question was, you stated that when she inquired of the Lord about what was going on within her stomach, about the nations and the older serving the younger. Does the rabbi say whether or not she ever communicated that to her husband? Or
That's a
was that
great
something
question. Yes,
she
it's a
just
great
kept to
question.
herself?
Okay, so here's the way it was explained to me by my teacher. Yitzchak was a prophet. He had his own relationship to God. Rivka figured out that if God did not reveal the true nature of the two sons to Yitzchak, he wasn't meant to know it. It wasn't her
Mm.
place. And because today we would say, like, why didn't she just say to him, hey, Yitzi, we got to talk. There's, there's something you need to know here. But she preserved that secret her entire life because it wasn't hers to tell. That's how close people were to the will of God. That if it was something that he needed to know, God would have told her it wasn't her place. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Because that makes sense of when she said, told him, let your curse be upon me. Like she knew something higher. Like, because when he was like having a concern, like, Mom, why are you asking me to do all of that? But when she made that statement and I read that in scripture, it just kind of let me believe she could do that because she honestly believed, okay, I know this is God's will and this is what he
Right.
wants.
Right.
So
And
that
this is what has to
clarifies,
happen.
yeah, that
Exactly.
clarifies that for me. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Great question. Okay. Unless anybody else has anything burning to say, I'm gonna finish this up. And thank you for joining me. It's always nice to see your faces and have somebody to talk to. When we started out, it was just Margaret and Andrea and me. So thank you for the rest of us for joining us. And have a good week. And thank you, Hashem, for leaving the electricity on long enough for us to get through class. Bye, guys.
Bye.